In this lesson, we'll be discussing what in many cases should be the last common issue that you'll be addressing on sentence corrections in the GMAT, and that's issues of idiom. So let's first recap the logistics for sentence corrections on the verbal section of the exam. Of course, we remember that they are assumed to not be the least frequently occurring question type. There's generally going to be approximately the same number of sentence corrections as there are reading comprehension questions in a verbal section of the GMAT. And we know that generally there are 2 or 3 more sentence corrections than critical reasoning questions on that section. And of course, strategically, we need to spend the least amount of time on average on sentence corrections. So that's going to be about 90 seconds on average. You're going to have a pretty hard cap of 2 minutes for any sentence correction because generally, if you're spending more than that amount of time, it's not getting better and you're just wasting time that could have been spent better elsewhere. Of course, minimize yourself to a single reread before you begin eliminating and guessing to save time, because once again, if you're down to a couple of options and you can see the difference but can't determine which is better, and often that is the case with idioms, you're better off just making a decision and moving on. You do have to beware of listening for errors. Now, that said, I may say this from time to time in this lesson about kind of listening to how it sounds, but that's dangerous because unfortunately, that's not like a clear and fast rule. We will be talking about some clear and fast rules for idioms here today, but sometimes you just kind of have to rely on your instincts. But you still will want to look for differences indicating possible sentence correction issues that are common, including those of idioms. So, let's talk about how we seek idiom errors on the GMAT. So, first, you do kind of have to rely on your English instincts for things that just seem immediately incorrect and disconcerting. You're just like, that doesn't seem to be the way it should be. You will want to also carefully track conjunctions, transitions, small words in lists and comparisons because oftentimes idioms are, in a way, kind of in tandem with issues of parallelism and comparisons lists, even potentially modifying phrases. And you do just want to try to avoid remembering the rule in the moment because if it's not immediately apparent to you, kind of reaching for it in your mind can often cause you to actually misremember or convince yourself of a rule that isn't actually a rule for English. So, strategically, you have to be able to not only identify an idiomatic error, but you also need to know immediately what the correct alternative should be if you're going to use issues of idiom as part of your evaluation for GMAT sentence corrections. You have to know not only what's wrong, but how to fix it. And this is really the only instance with our common issues on the sentence corrections when that is the case, because you've heard me in other lessons say, don't predict the fix. You don't know how the exam will make the correct answer correct. But here, there are just proper usages per rules of the language. Now, idiom should be the final evaluation item if you have any doubt as to what the correct answer should do to use that idiom correctly. So if you're like, I don't know whether it's whereas or wherefore, which is something we won't actually go into here in this lesson because it's so obscure, you don't want to be focusing on that first. Instead, seek alternative, potentially quote unquote easier issues. Again, especially the first 3 common issues that we've talked about in other lessons of subject verb agreement, verb tenses, and pronouns or articles, because those issues can be more definitive for most GMAT test takers if they just track the subject and verb, if they just track the pronoun and article and their reference. It's easier to force yourself to the right answer there as opposed to knowing an idiom or not in many cases. And recognize also that idiomatic differences are rarely the only issue that is tested in a single GMAT sentence correction. So that means if you are down to a couple of options and you're like, it seemed to be just focused on the idiom, really look and see if there's a different subtle difference that you could focus on, because except on some of the very hardest questions, it's exceedingly unlikely that they are solely testing idiomatic differences. So let's begin by talking about idioms of counting, starting with just those for limited quantities in English. So the word couple means literally 2. That's it. Few could mean 2, but technically by definition, means a small number, but something that's greater than one. So if you have a few options, you could theoretically have two options. Most people do not use few instead of a couple in that instance, but it is possible, but it's going to be a small number. So rule of thumb kind of around like 5 or fewer, but again, it is oddly ambiguous. Several is going to be a number that is greater than 2, but less than many. So again, it seems ambiguous, and it is, but if we've got several options, generally in English, that means that we have more than a few options, and that few is usually more than a couple of options. But you can see we use greater than or equal to signs because a few could be a couple and several could be few. I know that it's ambiguous. Sometimes English is an exceedingly frustrating language. If we think about it in another way, this isn't even on the slide, but most means more than 50%. So if most dogs do something, then more than 50% of them do something. But least dogs doesn't have a meaning. It would be the least of the dogs, and it's literally the last, as opposed to less than 50%. Again, English has some ambiguities built into it, and limited quantities are one of those places that those ambiguities exist. Now, when we're differentiating between different things, between is actually more specific than I just used it. Between means two items exactly. And conversationally, that sort of misuse happens all the time. But on the exam, they will potentially test this on harder questions. So you could say something properly, such as, I must decide between the two options because I'm picking one or the other. So between is always two items exactly that you're differentiating between. Now, among is for more than two items. So I can select my toppings from among the 7 condiments offered. So I wouldn't say I could select between the 7 condiments offered because that would mean it would almost be happening at like 3.5 condiments, and that's not what's happening. There's a multitude of options, and you can select among them. Again, just the nuances of English. Continuing with more counting idioms for countable quantities. You say fewer when something is countable. So there are fewer cats in the yard today because you can count the number of cats in the yard, as opposed to there are less cats in the yard today. You can also say many for countable items. So you could say there are many cats in the yard today. And that is, again, to a degree, ambiguous, but it's saying it's large in number, the amount of cats that are in the yard today. More is also countable. So there are more cats in the yard today would imply that there is a greater number of cats in the yard than there was today. Now, our uncountable quantities. Less is going to be for something that is not numerically quantifiable. So the yard is now less clean, presumably because of the cats. But you wouldn't say the yard is fewer clean. Clean is degree and undefined, so we use less instead of fewer. More, however, works for both countable and uncountable. So I could say the yard is more crowded. So again, it's clear there's a greater crowd, again, presumably because of the cats in the yard, and it's not defined exactly to what exact numeric degree the yard is more crowded. And much means that you are also uncountable. So the yard is much dirtier. So to some degree, the yard is dirtier today than it was yesterday, and it's a significant degree by placing much in front of dirty. Now, the catch here between much and more, because you may be saying to yourself, that seems pretty similar, is that much rather than more is going to modify another comparative or superlative. So I wouldn't say the yard is more dirtier. That probably to some of you just sounds bad. Again, I said sometimes we're going to use that terminology even though it's not great. Because if you said more dirtier, you go, I understand what you're saying, but it's not technically seeming all that great. Whereas much, that can modify the degree of a degree in English. So I could even say the yard is much more crowded, so it shows a degree of how much more the yard is crowded compared to before, presumably, the cats arrive. So those are some comparative idioms involving countable and uncountable quantities. So let's consider what happens when you're comparing explicitly numerable quantities. So recognize that there are alternative structures and rules that exist, and there's some ambiguities in those rules as well. So if we're just considering the prior examples, I could have said something to the effect of the number of cats in the yard is lower today than it was yesterday, and that would be acceptable, although it's a lot more succinct to say there are fewer cats today in the yard. But these are the most likely that you're going to encounter on the GMAT. So greater is when an increase can be represented as a number explicitly. So it's like the sort of thing that you would just conceptualize as a number pretty quickly. So the population of California is greater than that of Canada. Simple enough. There's a population that you can easily represent as a number, and that number is greater than that same number for Canada. Higher and lower are generally used if the compared item is explicitly economic or mathematic in nature. So that's when you see something like the GDP of California is higher than that of Canada. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, wouldn't greater be acceptable here as well? And probably there's not a huge difference. And for that reason, you may actually want to go look at a different issue if you found the difference between higher and greater. They're probably not adjudicating that since both are generally accepted, even though the convention may be that basically if you can represent something on like a bar graph or a line graph, it's probably going to be better to conceive of it as higher or lower because you can almost visualize it as physically being higher or lower on said graph. Canada's GDP could also be stated as lower than California's, as another example. Now, less is when a decrease can be represented as a number. So California's area is less than that of Canada. And you could also use lesser. So Canada or California has a lesser area than Canada. Again, you could do a lot of different structures with these counting things, or these counting idioms, but you just have to really know what isn't acceptable. Now, over under is going to be when you compare a quantity against a defined standard and a numbered quantity. So something such as California's GDP is over $3 trillion per year would be acceptable because we know that the GDP is over that benchmark. But I would not say California's GDP is $3 trillion over Canada's. That would not be acceptable because we'd want to say $3 trillion more than Canada's or greater than Canada's. Again, there's some ambiguity about more or greater, but you can see when over under is not generally accepted. So let's move on and take a look at an example sentence correction to illustrate all of these counting idiom next. So we have the lead to chrome ratios in yellow and green inks differs slightly. Yellow ink has a higher amount of lead to chrome than green ink does. Now, you only want to use idiomatic differences as reason to eliminate if you're 100% certain of the error and the fix. And we can see that there's an immediately apparent difference of higher and greater. We just said an amount is numeric. Does this quantify as something that's explicitly numeric or economic in structure with ratios? Maybe, I'm not sure. But if the correct option isn't readily apparent, like immediately, you're like, that's wrong, to one of them at least, seek another easier difference in the choices. And if we look at the choices C and D, we could see that we've got differs versus differ. And this is going to be much more directly evaluated because we can find the subject in the non-underlined portion as the lead to chrome ratios. And those ratios, they differ, not differs, because ratios is plural. So we need the plural verb for that plural subject, which allows us to get rid of A, B, and C without even considering the idiomatic issue of higher versus greater. And oftentimes the exam will employ idiomatic differences where either is acceptable to try to keep you from noticing a more definitive error in some of those answer choices. Then you will want to check your proper counting idioms by tracking the item or items being counted or compared using this and that as necessary. So we've got choice E, and we can just focus on the comparative aspect. We've got the yellow ink or this has more than that than that. No, I can't say this has more than that than that. There's too many thans here. We know that E is immediately eliminated. So then we just want to read our choice back into the sentence to confirm there are no new errors or changes in meaning. So the lead to chrome ratios in yellow and green inks differ slightly. The yellow ink has a higher amount of lead to chrome than green ink does, and choice D correctly captures the intent of the original, we ended up sticking with higher. But if there was another issue and it ended up being greater in choice D, D would still be the right answer. You are generally going to default to the original when you're considering sentence corrections, but it's not an issue of higher versus greater. It's all of these other problems that we found in the answer choices that were much more definitive as opposed to that idiomatic difference that ends up making us choose choice D. So then let's take a look at a couple more differences or different types of idiom that you might encounter on the GMAT, starting with causalities. So we'll start with because of. So because of technically is what is known as an adverbial phrase, and it must follow an action. So that would be something such as the dog ran away because of the shrill noise. So the action the dog ran away leads directly into because of, and because of must follow that action. You may be thinking to yourself, well, couldn't we say the dog ran away due to the shrill noise? And the answer is actually no, because due to has to follow a noun and usually some form of the verb to be. So due to is it's due to a noun. Because of is because of a verb. So the dog's fearful response, however, was due to the shrill noise, could be a correct structure because the dog's fearful response is a noun, and that noun was due to the shrill noise is acceptable. Now, the last of our causal uh, indicator terms is going to be since. And since is most correctly going to indicate passage of time as opposed to causality. Now, you could potentially have at least conversationally, and probably not incorrect even on the GMAT structure of since there was a shrill noise, the dog ran away. Clearly, you can see that it's because of the shrill noise that the dog ran away. But more correctly, since is going to indicate passage of time, and neither of the other two options do. So, since it was young, the dog has disliked shrill noise. So, that's indicating that over the passage of time, since it was young and moving forward through the has disliked, the dog, even now, probably after no longer being young, still dislikes shrill noise. Now, if I change the sentence to read, because it was young, the dog disliked shrill noise, that's saying that the cause of its dislike is being young, as opposed to this sentence, which is saying that over a period of time, the dog has disliked shrill noise consistently. So, just again, always tied to meaning when we're considering our differences of idiom, but there are subtle differences in meaning and a little bit of that adverb adjective kind of structure for these three different ways to introduce causalities or express causalities. Now, conditionals also are defined by intent and meaning. So, if introduces a condition that indicates explicit cause and effect. So, if is like, if this happens, then the next thing will occur. So, it would be acceptable to say, if we score next, we will win, because that's the condition that must be met to win. I can't say whether we score next, we will win, because that makes it sound like, I don't know, whether do we not? And that's because whether introduces two alternatives instead. So whether is going to be when you have two explicit and sometimes implicit options, either of which could occur, such as, I wonder whether it will rain today. I don't want to say, I wonder if it will rain today, because I wonder if it will rain today leads to and cause traffic accidents, because there has to be an outcome of that conditional. Whereas here, there's just a wondering of whether it will or will not rain today, although you don't need to place the or not. The or not here would be redundant because whether itself always implies the two options basically of yes or no. Now, if you do use whether or not, the only time it won't be redundant is when you introduce something that is ultimately an irrelevant condition, such as whether or not we win will make the playoffs. Because apparently the team you and I are on, we will make the playoffs regardless of winning. Because if we win, if we do not win, we will make the playoffs. And the whether is used because it's only a two option dichotomy. So these are the ways in which that you can use conditionals when you're dealing with idioms properly. So let's go ahead, take a look at an example. As always, we need to read the sentence as it's written first. So, in most cases, it is difficult to tell whether a basketry fragment derived from a shaped basket container or from a flat mat. So, we can see quite obviously we've got some whethers and ifs here. So, right in the answer choices, we could tell we may need to distinguish between whether it's whether or if. And we remember that's when there are two options. So we know that you have to focus on the intent of the original sentence and know those idiomatic rules. So here we're clearly discussing in the sentence one of two options. And when it's one of two options, we're going to have to go with a whether as opposed to the if. Now, we then have to confirm that whichever idiom we choose maintains a complete sentence. So we'll read these two options and we can see it is difficult to tell whether a basketry fragment derived from a shaped basket container or from a flat mat versus it can be difficult to tell whether a basketry fragment derived from a shaped basket container or from a flat mat. And that can be switches the meaning because it said is in the original. We always have to default to the original. And if we go back to our ifs, and this is how you can remember, if has to introduce a hypothetical. So if I said, in most cases, it is difficult to tell if a basketry fragment derived from a shaped basket container or from a flat mat, and it has to do something. Because if that derived basketry fragment, that now is a descriptor and not the main verb, because whether it derived is the action. If a derived fragment from somewhere is becoming a descriptor, if we switch from whether to if, it's very subtle. But we read our choice back in. In most cases, it is difficult to tell whether a basketry fragment derived from a shaped basket container or from a flat mat, the derived is the action. It's difficult to tell whether it did derive from here or from there, and our correct answer is A, and we're certain about it because of all these reasons. So now let's talk about just some additives. So these are ways to combine two items or more items. In most cases here, it's going to be two, though. So both. This is used to combine two items of equal stature. So you'll have to use and as the only acceptable conjunction. You can't say both this as well as that. It's just both this and that. So Harshita was both hungry and tired. We're just saying that the two feelings of being hungry and tired are equivalent, and Harshita was both of those things. Simple enough, probably the most straightforward of our common additive structures that we'll see on the test. Now, we also could see not only but also. So this is used to present two items, the second of which is somewhat surprising. So the items have to be parallel both conceptually and grammatically because it basically functions kind of like a list. All of these additive structures are technically miniature lists. And Harshita was not only hungry but also tired, indicates that the tiredness is kind of excessive to the hunger. And there's a slight difference in meaning by using not only but also as opposed to just the both this and that, but each creates an absolutely acceptable grammatic structure in English. Now, the one that gets a little bit tricky is when to use the as well as. So it's very similar in meaning to not only but also, but it gets employed in different ways as compared to the others. So it does not create a compound or plural subject. So we'd say something such as Harshita as well as John was late. So the as well as John is just saying that there's someone else who was the same thing as Harshita, and Harshita was late. So again, very subtle differences here, but hopefully this will allow you to, again, look at one of the more commonly used idiomatic structures that are really informed again by meaning, because as well as means like there's two different people, but I'm just saying that, or two different items, and there's this one item that does a thing, and this other does kind of the same thing. And it's different than the both, which is just they're similar items directly. So, one more sample sentence correction here where we'll consider some of these common additives. So, as always, we read the sentence up front to start. So, Danangan Kalanduyan. And one of the things that I generally recommend for folks is you don't actually have to try to pronounce that name. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly. I hope that I am. But you could just call that individual DK. So, DK, director of the PK Ensemble. Make it simple for yourself because those non-underlined portions do not matter for the underline. So DK not only trains Filipino Americans in the art of K music, so kulantang apparently, but performs internationally as well as, like Samang Sam, as an ethnomusicologist by training. There's a lot of stuff in here. And we can, if we cut away all of those proper nouns, which again is a common thing of the exam to try to make you focus on stuff that doesn't matter, which again is why it believes that sentence corrections are to a degree kind of relevant here. Part of your job as a manager is going to be to determine what matters and what doesn't when you're evaluating things. And we can find a clear additive idiomatic structure of not only and but. So let's consider whether we can actually identify an idiom error in this original structure. And you may recall that this should be a not only, but also. So we can predict what the correct idiom should be because we just saw it, and we know that it should be not only, but also, not only, but. So we can eliminate A and B immediately. Then you could consider additional structures using this and that to test the proper idiom. So you can see we've got an as well as afterwards as well. So we've got but performs internationally as well as like Samong Sam. And you're like, okay, well, you'd either say as well as Samong Sam, you wouldn't have the like in between the as well as. So he does this the same as the other person, or is like this person, but I can't do and be like. It's kind of contradictory. So that eliminates choice D. And we then consider one more version, and we go, but also performs internationally along with like Samong Sam and is. And if we did performs internationally along with, and you're like, no, and that just doesn't make logical sense. And if we wanted to use it this or that, it's not necessarily as required here because you could hopefully see pretty quickly that the as well as and the along with are not what we need. But we then, of course, want to read our choice back into the sentence to confirm no new errors or changes in meaning. And so we'll try to pronounce things here to close out the exercise. But again, you don't necessarily have to on the exam. So Danangang Kalanduyan, director of the Palabunian Kulintang Ensemble, not only trains Filipino Americans in the art of Kulintang music, but also performs internationally like Samang Sam. So now he performs internationally like this other person does. And performs internationally and like Samang Song is an ethnomusicologist by training. So again, we've got the DK does this thing and this other thing. So performs and is, and that's a proper comparative additive. Doesn't have the word both in front of it, but doesn't confuse the meaning and is our correct answer. So, whole lot of idioms, and we're far from comprehensive in this lesson, unfortunately. Well, kind of fortunately, because you don't want to be fixating on idioms, really. Instead, when you're dealing with idioms, carefully read the sentences written. As always, note any immediately erroneous idioms and eliminate any choices repeating the error, but only if they're immediately erroneous and you know definitively, almost instinctively by English, that they're wrong. You want to proactively seek the correct idiom if you find an idiom issue that you know is wrong in the choices. And if your predicted correct idiom is in the choices, choose it. That's probably it. It can be that idioms are almost like a little bit of like I'll use the term cheat code here, but kind of a shortcut. Because if you recognize an idiomatic structure, like with whether versus it, you might be able to go there a little bit faster. But if your predicted correct idiom is not in the choices, go find a different issue because you're probably misremembering an idiomatic rule or like honestly you've kind of conjured one up on your own. Go look for other issues. And then, as always, read your choice back into the sentence to ensure that it logically captures the intent of the original without introducing any new changes or errors in that original sentence. So now, let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at a couple more idioms, including at least one or two that we haven't discussed in the slides because there are so many idiomatic structures, and see how we can address this probably most difficult common issue on the GMAT. So here we have a sample sentence correction, and we're going to set up the scratch work as we do every time. We got A through E with a little line over top for a possible issue if we identify it in the sentences written. So starting by reading, pipe making is a recognized art with skilled pipe makers using carefully selected materials, and they are considered to be among the most special objects used in North America. And You may be thinking to yourself, hey, there's that among. We were just talking about among versus between. Maybe that's an issue in the choices. But if we scan the choices, we discover there's no between. And this is a common tactic of the exam to put little idiomatic differences that you tend to fixate on and ignore more meaningful differences that create clear errors in the intent of the sentence as originally presented. Because if we look at the beginning of this underline, we see a they. And we know that for all pronouns, we have to go find the clear, unambiguous reference. So they is a plural third person pronoun. So we need to find a plural subject for this they, which are considered the most among the most special objects used in North America. And if we go before the they, we find materials, and we've got pipe makers. Now, the materials are used to make the pipes. They themselves are not the most special objects used in North America, or among the most special objects. And of course, the pipe makers, we shouldn't call them objects either. So we've found an ambiguous pronoun in the idiom lesson. So we'll eliminate choices A and B for those erroneous theys before we even begin talking about a more subtle idiomatic issue that exists in the sentence as it's presented. Now, we then look at the remaining answer choices, and the differences are basically the shortness to a degree. So we've got very close to the original. Pipes are considered to be among in choice D. We've got pipes are considered among and pipes considered. So we know that the exam does generally prefer concision. So if we consider choice E first, we've got, and pipes considered the most special objects used in North America. Well, that changes the meaning markedly and suddenly requires the pipes to have some sort of verb for that secondary subject. So E changes the meaning because now pipes are the most special objects or some subset of pipes and are no longer just considered among the most special objects. So this changes the meaning definitively from what was originally intended. And we can eliminate choice E, even though it is the shortest option. But then when you're considering more obscure idiom, you often will be well positioned if you just consider, do I need the extra words? And generally, the default on the exam is to omit or delete. So we've got considered to be among versus considered among. And this, again, is one of those obscure idiom rules in English that we didn't even discuss in the lesson, but considered doesn't require any preposition after it. And in fact, the source material that I got this sentence from actually used the considered to be incorrectly. And that is just a common misuse. And the way that it's more easily adjudicated, even if you didn't know before that considered doesn't need a preposition following it, you could just say, does the to be add anything to this sentence? Because that allows us to potentially even eliminate D for being redundant, even though it is also an idiomatic error. And idiom, as we talked about, it's kind of like that shortcut cheat code. If you know that considered requires no preposition, you'll probably get to C pretty quickly. But as always, read the sentence with your choice before selecting to confirm that it doesn't introduce any errors or confusion or change the meaning in any way. So pipe making is a recognized art with skilled pipe makers using carefully selected materials. And pipes are considered among the most special objects used in North America. Everything makes sense. It captures a logical meaning and is our correct answer. So if we scroll on down, we'll take a look at one more sample sentence correction here. So setting up the scratchpad, as always, we got A, B, C, D, E. Once again, with our little line over top. And so reading this at the outset, we've got any person who is neither party to the 5-year reviews or an interested party may submit a brief written statement pertinent to the reviews by May. So we do have a relatively clear idiomatic two-part structure of neither and or. And if you're going to look at any two-part structure, not only will we need to consider any idiomatic issues, we also have to make sure that it's parallel. And idiom and parallelism comparisons, lists, and even modifiers are often very closely related. So let's break this down. And so we're going to have our introductory word of neither. And that leads to part one of the list. So we've got party to the reviews. And we'll leave out the 5-year reviews. That's just a descriptive term that doesn't really affect the list all that much. And then we've got the part that probably is already jumping out as incorrect, an or. And that or leads to part two, which is our non-underlined portion, which is an interested party. So right now, you've probably already established that we don't need neither or. It should be neither nor. So that allows us to eliminate choice A, choice C. And if we look at choice E, we switch to either. Well, if it's either, that means that it's acceptable. Neither means that it's not. So E is out literally for changing the meaning. Then we get to potentially the hardest part because we've got either neither a party to the 5-year reviews nor versus neither party without the A. So we have to decide whether or not we need that A. And we have to always use the non-underlined portion to inform that. And we see that we've got an and after our underline. And so we do need the article before the party in the underlined portion to remain parallel. And that allows us to eliminate choice B. And as always, we read the sentence with our choice to confirm it captures the intended meaning. Any person who is neither a party to the 5-year reviews nor an interested party may submit a brief written statement pertinent to the reviews by May that captures the intent of the original, uses the proper idiom, and changes it to neither a this nor an or a that as a proper parallel structure. So D is our correct answer here. Go ahead and practice your own set of idiom questions to improve on some of these idioms. But remember, also always look for our other issues when thinking about sentence corrections in the verbal section.